As of the making of this video, the Democratic presidential primary is not officially over. Currently, Vice President Joe Biden holds a 1,217 to 914 pledged delegate lead over Senator Bernie Sanders. This means Biden has about 61% of the 1,991 pledged delegates needed to win the nomination on the first ballot. Despite this, the race, for all intents and purposes, is over. Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee, and the question I would like to explore today is how this happened. Just over 1 month ago, Senator Bernie Sanders was the undisputed frontrunner in the race. After his blowout win in Nevada, Nate Silver's projections favored him to win all 50 states. But yet his campaign utterly collapsed at a pace I did not know was possible, and failed to capture the nomination. So to quote the great Hillary Clinton, what happened? One thing I believe this presidential race has made clear is that narrative is everything. The narrative, whether we like it or not, is controlled by what we call the mainstream media. Cable news covers and selects stories in a way that sets the course for how the entire nation views said topics. So when Iowa passed and Bernie Sanders was in a tie with Mayor Pete Buttigieg for the victory of the catastrophe known as the Iowa caucuses, the narrative of Mayor Pete being the main competitor to Sanders caused voters to flee from Biden, the original frontrunner in the polls, to him, boosting him 9 points in the polls in New Hampshire, almost to a tie with Sanders. However, when it emerged that Sanders won the most votes in Iowa, then won New Hampshire, then crushed in Nevada, the media had no choice. The narrative was that Bernie Sanders was winning. Don't get me wrong, they would try to scare people away from him and be confrontational with him and undermine him at every turn, but they were forced to admit that he was the winner, creating that key narrative. It also helped that Sanders was leading in the polls in nearly every Super Tuesday state, most importantly both California and Texas. South Carolina altered the narrative when Joe Biden crushed Bernie Sanders, winning by 30%, but it still remained similar to before, given that he had framed it as his firewall and was essentially holding on for dear life in the state. In the 3 days before Super Tuesday, everything changed. On what YouTuber and political commentator Kyle Kulinski calls Bloody Monday, both Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg dropped out of the race and endorsed Biden, rendering literally all polling useless as no one had any clue what would happen. The media for 48 hours straight ran non-stop positive coverage for Biden, while Sanders was the foe which the other candidates had united against to overcome. With it now a four-way race between Biden, Bloomberg, Sanders, and Warren, all of the undecided voters flocked to Biden, and he mopped Super Tuesday. So what did Bernie need to do? Well, the absolute best, clutchest thing he could have done before Super Tuesday would have been to convince Senator Warren to drop out and endorse him. Senator Warren had underperformed in the earlier contest, but nationally her profile was just as large as Senator Klobuchar and Mayor Pete combined. Her supporters were most certainly would have followed suit to Sanders, and with Bloomberg in the race, that support would have put him over the top in so many key states like Minnesota, Maine, her home state of Massachusetts, and even Texas. Now she would have been reluctant to go along with this, and hindsight is 20/20, but I believe he should have done whatever was necessary to earn her endorsement, and I doubt that Sanders did that behind the scenes. So after 2 days of free positive press, Biden crushed Super Tuesday. The date was now Wednesday, March 4th. The dust had settled, and Biden led by a little over 50 delegates, essentially a tie, but with all of the momentum. The nature, the foundation of the race had fundamentally changed, but the Sanders campaign failed to realize this. The senator went in front of the press and declared, "I like Joe. Joe is a nice guy, and I do not want this campaign to degenerate into a Trump-type epic where we are attacking each other. I thoroughly respect the principle behind this, but that was absolutely not what he should have been saying if he wanted to win this contest. It is not necessary to declare there will be no personal attacks. He could simply not issue any personal attacks. Also, critiques of a politician's record are not personal attacks. They are essential to understand how that person would govern and are important to consider when deciding who to vote for. This type of rhetoric did nothing to steer voters away from Biden and towards Sanders, but rather only fed into the narrative that Biden was the safe choice if they had not yet been convinced by Sanders and were not sure who to support. What he needed was to reset the narrative, to say that a new race had begun and that he and Biden were starting 0-0. Admit that he had lost last night. Everyone knew it, but remind everyone that despite his loss, he was tied because he destroyed Biden in the contest leading up to Super Tuesday. Point out how in the states in which they spent the most time, Iowa and New Hampshire, Sanders won, and the entire party ran from Biden, as the more they saw him, the less they liked him. Give people hope that the future contest would be fundamentally different from Super Tuesday, because the race had fundamentally changed. The only inkling of this I saw from the Sanders campaign was when Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez appeared on Chris Cuomo's CNN show and declared that Bernie was still likely to win, because Tuesday was simply a political moment, not a political movement. This is the proper rhetoric to have. It shapes the narrative in your favor as much as possible. Instead of acting like nothing has changed, even though everyone knows you lost, does nothing to combat the frenzy of positive media that the campaign should have known Biden would receive. A campaign ad saying this was not enough. It should have been coming from the mouth of every candidate every 10 minutes following what happened on March 3rd. The media would have shifted their narrative in kind. As much as they wanted to see the defeat of the Sanders campaign, they wanted one thing more: a tight race. Primary elections mean big ratings and big money for cable news. So an early ending is the last thing they would want. They would love a Biden-Sanders contested one-on-one election, even if they painted it as Biden good versus Sanders bad, or Biden rational versus Sanders crazy, or whatever. The narrative would be that Sanders was toe-to-toe with Biden, not lagging behind. And the failure to react and help mold that changing narrative is what cemented the idea throughout the country that Biden would be the nominee, initiating the bandwagon effect and discouraging potential Sanders voters, leading to the Michigan loss, which was the nail in the coffin for the Sanders campaign. The Bernie Sanders campaign was a success in a myriad of ways, but it ultimately failed its goal of obtaining the Democratic nomination, and that was due to, among many factors, their inability or unwillingness to act on their feet and change course. This can be seen in Sanders' unwillingness to court establishment endorsements after gaining frontrunner status in Nevada, their inability to make inroads with black Southern voters, and their ineffectiveness in making the electability argument, all topics I would love to explore more in depth in other videos. But most critically was the negligence of the changing structures of the race which they were competing in, which was the final straw for what could have been a revolutionary political movement in America. Now I am fascinated to hear your thoughts on this. Did I get it right? Was this the tactical error that hurt Sanders, or was it something else? Let me know below, and I will read what all of you have to say. Thank you so much.